Welcome to LSN TV. And I think you're going to enjoy our guest this evening. He's somebody we all admire at LifeSite News. He's an incredible researcher, investigative journalist, does a tremendous job. I think he's quite unique. And he adds a touch of humor to everything he does with his unique personality, which we really enjoy. But we're dealing with some pretty serious subjects in what he reports. And we've published, I think, about 13 of his extensive articles on LifeSite News, and we've quoted him in many situations. So anyway, let me introduce to you James Corbett of the Corbett Report. Hello, James. Welcome to LifeSite News.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Truth has a power of its own. It moves hearts and saves lives. It heals wounds and restores souls, but only if it is heard. That's why our enemies are working nonstop to suppress the truth. That's why LifeSite News is the most censored life, faith, and family news source in the world. They are working to keep you in the dark. They are working overtime to make you feel alone and forgotten. But God says, I will never forget you. God never leaves us without hope of victory. And LifeSite News will never stop sharing the truth that sets us free. We will tell the truth without fear. We will tell the truth without compromise. And as mainstream platforms silence us, we will build our own. That's why I'm pleased to announce the launch of the new LSN TV app, which can bring all of LifeSite News' top video content direct to your phone, tablet, computer, and TV so that you can bypass the censors and keep fighting with us for life, faith, family, and freedom. Don't be alone in the darkness. We've been canceled. Fight the cancellation. Download the app.
All right. So, not everybody, in fact, maybe many people don't know who you are. Now, I know you get this asked all the time, and you have a great page on your website that extensively goes over that. But still, for the benefit of those who aren't going to do that, who is James Corbett? When and why did you start the Corbett Report? And how many viewers over the years, if you know, maybe you don't know. And why are you in Japan? You're Canadian from Alberta.
Good questions. Yes, I am a Canadian, born and raised in Alberta, and spent all of my life there until after graduating from the University of Calgary, I decided to go and have a little adventure over in Dublin, Ireland, where I studied Anglo-Irish literature for a year to get my master's degree. And then after that, I was casting about for different ideas. What will I do with my life? Now that I have my English degree, what are you going to do with it other than frame it? Well, I decided to go teach English over in Asia. Something different, something completely different, something to do in a way to see a bit of the world and hopefully earn a bit of money. And so I came over here to Japan about 20 years ago now. And well, it was originally going to be for 1 year, but here we are 20 years later. I have a home, a family, wife and kids. So definitely this is my home at this point. And somewhere along the way, I got involved with precisely what I said I was not going to do. When I was taking my English degree at the University of Calgary, people would ask me, what are you going to do with that degree? And my answer would always be, I don't know, but I'm not going to be a teacher and I'm not going to be a journalist. And I ended up somehow becoming both. So after coming here to teach English, I started down the proverbial internet rabbit hole. Specifically in 2006, there were just a number of events and situations, and including moving into a new apartment here in Japan that came with an internet connection. It was the first time I had an internet connection in my home since I left my parents' home several years before that point. So I was just immersed in the world of not just YouTube, but Google Video and all of these new platforms that were taking off at that time. I started to get immersed in all sorts of information, documentaries, subject matter that I had never encountered anywhere else. And I started looking into things that for me were unthinkable before, like 9/11 and what really happened on September 11th, 2001. And after a period of several months of researching, falling down that rabbit hole, finding documents and other things online that were just absolutely shocking to me, I decided I had to get this information out there, get my voice out there in whatever way I could. This being the internet age, I decided to start a podcast. And this was back in 2007 when most people had no idea what a podcast was, but I guess I happened to be at the right place at the right time on the rising tide that was happening online at that point. And so I started the Corbett Report in 2007 here we are 17 years later, and now this is my full-time living. This is what I do for my career.
How many reports have you done? Have you ever counted them?
No, it would be hard to count. Of my actual proper flagship podcast, I believe I'm on episode 462 of that.
Right.
But I've done almost 2,000 interviews. I've done several hundred other reports on various other subjects. So thousands of reports, let's put it that way.
And you support yourself. It's through it being a nonprofit organization, the Corbett Report. Is that correct?
Well, not a nonprofit organization. I'm certainly not registered with any government or what have you, but it is donation based. It is viewer supported completely. I don't do any advertising. I don't take any money from any shady corporations or what have you. It is all just from the support of people out there. And that was one of the things that really shocked, amazed, and in some ways gladdened my heart to know that it is possible to do this. I am living proof that it is possible to actually circumvent that entire infrastructure of advertising and payment and all of that gets in the way of real journalism. If you put out if you're consistent and you work hard and you put out a good product that people are actually interested in, they will support it. Even though I give all of my work away 100% for free, you do not need to pay me a cent to access my work. But there are enough people who do that I can afford to do this.
Well, we seem to have a lot in common, but you do it on your own, whereas we have quite a large team. But still, we're glad you've been doing what you've done, and we're very much appreciative of it. Okay, so one thing I noticed is that you deal with some really hard subjects, which a lot of people don't deal with, and you have the freedom to do so because of the way you've set yourself up, and we have that same freedom, thank God. So we're going to get into a really difficult subject today, but why should viewers believe what you say versus what all the mainstream media are reporting? I have noticed that you do tremendous work, and maybe you could answer that question.
Well, I would actually counter such a contention by saying that, in fact, a lot of the data points that I use in constructing my reports are actually from mainstream sources of information. And in fact, one of the best pieces of criticism that I ever received against the documentary that I did on the US Federal Reserve banking system about a decade ago, I released a documentary on that. And one of the comments, the criticisms was, well, this is mostly just the Federal Reserve's own PR statements and things that they have on their website. And I said, yes, exactly right. I am critiquing it from within the information and data that they are freely admitting. And I think that's what I base my work on, is information that is widely and openly available, that I can point to, and I will always tell people the sources of information that I'm using so that they can go and follow it themselves and decide for themselves whether or not they want to take that information on board.
Excellent. Very good. Now, to do this kind of work, it can be difficult at times. What personally motivates and sustains you to keep doing this and to do it as well as you do?
Well, it is a very good question, because it certainly can be thankless work at times, and in fact the opposite of thankful. It can be people genuinely hostile to what I am attempting to put out there. I would say if I was motivated by some sort of external stimulus, that I was looking for praise or some sort of external reward, I probably would not be doing this. I'm doing it because I know for myself how utterly transformative it was to discover this information and to see that there's demonstrably, documentably, a vast gulf between what is being talked about and what is being shown on the nightly news and what is happening in reality. And once you see that gulf for yourself, I just think there's no going back from that point. So even if I wasn't doing this as a website, as my living at this point, I would still be doing this research. It's just that it's very convenient for me to have a platform to be able to put it out there, and hopefully it's valuable to people out there to receive that.
Great. Well, we've done this introduction to you and why you do what you do and how you do what you do and so on for a reason. Because our conversation today is going to be about a very contentious topic about which there are strong opinions, as we've learned. Viewers are going to ask, why should I listen to or believe James Corbett? Now, so do you have an answer to that?
I always say, I have said this from the very beginning, don't believe James Corbett. Don't believe really any talking head pronouncing reality for you. I 100%, I have faith in the intellectual ability of every single person listening to this conversation to take information on board, to parse it, to determine what is true and what is not for themselves. You are big boys and girls out there. You can do the thinking for yourself. You do not need me or anyone else to tell you what to believe, and you should not believe anyone who says, believe me or trust me. That is why I put the sources out there in my work. I am connecting the dots in certain ways, but you might connect them otherwise.
Yeah, so they can follow the evidence that you provided and see it for themselves. Okay, well, we're going to explore your unique views on the current situation in Israel, what may have led to it, where it's going, and how it might possibly be resolved. Our own experiences of LifeScience News have been that there is a general intolerance of any criticism of Israeli actions from Israel itself, from the media, U.S. government institutions, and even a significant number of our Christian readers. We've also been accused of being anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, lying, not condemning the October 7th invasion, not caring about all those killed on October 7th by the Hamas terrorists, all of which have been false accusations. That's been surprising considering the efforts we've made to verify everything, just like you do. And we've quoted many Jewish sources, and I noticed that you've also covered the conflict. And I've been impressed with your reports. I have to admit that prior to October the 7th, I knew very little about Israel, other than it contains what we know as the sacred Holy Land. And there have always been Muslim versus Jewish conflicts in Israel. We all know that. Israel has a powerful military. For a Jewish religious state, it has seemed contradictory, though, that it is socially very liberal, including providing free abortions and implemented one of the most intense national COVID vaccination campaigns in the world, which ended up harming many Israeli citizens. The program resulted from Benjamin Netanyahu's personal arrangement with Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla, an Israeli and some other country dual passport holder. We also just recently discovered that many other top people in the U.S. three-letter agencies and other top COVID vaccine company executives are also Israel-U.S. dual passport holders. Go figure. Anyway, that is mostly all I knew. But since then, it has been mind-blowing what we have learned about Israel, and more specifically, Zionism, which I knew nothing about. LifeSite already knew a lot about Islam, but almost nothing about Zionism. And the history of the conflict between Palestinians and the Zionists, we knew nothing about. So after this long introduction, can you give an overview of what you've discovered about Israel and what the reaction has been to your reports?
Well, specifically with regards to the conflict that's taking place in Gaza right now,
Yeah,
I would situate that if we want to start that, and I always make this point, when examining any conflict like this, like what's happening in Ukraine or any sort of major international conflict, the question is always where you start the clock. And I have noticed that defenders of the Israeli government would love to start the clock on October 7th, 2023, as if history began on that date with this horrific attack out of the blue, and that justifies literally any response. And of course, I would beg to differ, that I don't think October 7th, 2023 is when history began. And I think that this is a part of a much, much larger history, obviously. But if we wanted to start on October 7th, 2023, we would still have many, many questions that we should be asking about what took place that day. Because in the ensuing months, there has been a flood of information coming out to question what we know or were told about the events of that day in the exact same way. In fact, in a very parallel way, they call this October 7th, they call it Israel's 9/11. Well, that's interesting for me because I have spent the last couple of decades researching what really happened on 9/11, and it was not what the US government told us it was. In the same way, I don't think October 7th, 2023 is what the Israeli government tells us it was. And there are many different data points that we could use to construct a very different narrative of that day. For example, we could start by talking about the fact that this was, even by mainstream sources, again, going from Haaretz and Ynet News and other mainstream sources of information, we know that the Israeli government had foreknowledge of these attacks. They were warned of these attacks, for example, by Egypt and other countries. We know, for example, that there was a great degree of intelligence within the Israeli the IDF and the Israeli security forces about potential plans for something along these lines, including the fact that Hamas was supposedly creating these bases that were based on the IDF bases across the border, that they were practicing raiding and other such things like this. But beyond that, even what took place on October 7th, or what we're asked to believe took place, is virtually impossible. And this doesn't come from me. This comes from people who are in a position to know this, people who have actually worked on that border, who know the intense amount of surveillance that takes place across that border, that know that so much as a cat disturbing the fence would be picked up by these monitors and would be immediately investigated by IDF forces. But for some reason, on October 7th, not only were these people able to hang glide or paraglide into across the border with complete impunity, but allowed to operate for hours upon hours upon hours with no, with literally no military backup or response for several hours, which is, again, unthinkable and impossible. And I cite people like Efrat Fenigson, who herself, she has worked on that border, knows about the security precautions that are in place, and said that what happened that day just is unthinkable. Beyond
Who was that person again? What was the name of the person?
Efrat Fenigson, E-F-R-A-T Fenigson. And if you look her up, she had a conversation, I believe it was on the Brett Weinstein's podcast, shortly after these events took place, where she was saying she cannot fathom how this could possibly have taken place unless, well, it was helped along in some fashion. But even beyond that, we now know, and it has now been confirmed, it was talked about for some time, that there was, of the people that were killed that day, some proportion of those people were killed by Israeli forces. And we're talking about Israelis killed by Israeli forces. This was talked about in the context of something called the Hannibal Directive, which is a standing order that exists in Israeli security forces to, in the event of a situation like this, to make sure that there are no hostages taken, to simply kill everyone. Kill them all and ask questions later is essentially what this order boils down to. And there's been a lot of talk about that for some time. But as it turns out, well, actually, that's been confirmed now. Haaretz just had a report just in the recent days that Israeli IDF not spokesman, but people within the IDF confirmed to Haaretz that the Hannibal Directive was in operation and that some Israeli citizens were killed as a result of orders that were given and taken and acted upon by Israeli security forces on that day. So
we just reported that ourselves today. It was on LifeSite. There's a story that we did on that same evidence in Haaretz. Yeah.
Yes. So all of this is to say, and there's plenty more information about this, but all of this is to say that even what we were told about October 7th, 2023 is at the very least incomplete. Let's put it that way. But I think highly suspicious with regard to the complete and total penetration of border defenses, as if they didn't exist at all, that took place that day. But even if we were simply to take it at face value, that this was this surprise terrorist attack out of the blue that could not have been predicted or prevented in any way, shape, or form whatsoever, and that the Israeli forces did absolutely everything perfectly that day, and it was a wonderful response that was completely justified. Let's look at what has happened since that point. Because, of course, what we have seen as a result of this is the fact that, for example, in just the days after the October 7th incident, you had Israeli President Isaac Herzog come out and say that literally every single person in the Gaza Strip is a viable target for Israeli operations there, that every single person is responsible for what happened on that day, which is a pretty remarkable statement. I mean, that in and of itself, on its face, is a war crime, the admission in advance of genocide, essentially. That absolutely every man, woman, and child, and baby, and infant is to be held accountable and responsible for what happened on October 7th is not just ludicrous, it's morally outrageous. And I think anyone who would hold to that has not even entered the realm of moral communication. and probably deserves to be excluded from any actual debate about what should or should not take place in the event of an incident like on October 7th. But unfortunately, we're talking about the president of Israel, so that kind of throws, well, at least some sort of wrench in the works there. Having said that, it's difficult. I mean, the mind boggles at trying to quantify, because of course we can talk about the tens of thousands of Gazans who have been directly killed as a result of these operations, let alone the millions that have been displaced and affected by the bombing of hospitals, the complete destruction of infrastructure, the repeated multiple times that Israeli forces have issued warnings and orders for Gazans to leave a certain area, to enter a certain other safe area, and then bombing that safe area. Other just blatant war crimes that have been taking place for the past several months. It is, again, morally outrageous to say the least. And one would think that anyone who was being truly not hypocritical would be able to see these outrages for what they were. But unfortunately, as you say, there's so much surrounding context to this, what's happening right now, that the starvation, the privation, the displacement of millions of people is seen as completely justifiable because of the narrative that has been constructed around us in the heads of people who have fallen for the Israeli government's propaganda.
So you said it didn't start, the clock didn't start on October 7th. When did it start?
Well, I mean, how many thousands of years would you like to go back? But okay, let's just take it from, for example, in the lead up to the creation, the birth of the Israeli state in 1948. How did we get to that point? And once again, I don't think you have to go out on a limb and cite some crazy conspiracy source on this. Once again, for example, Haaretz had an op-ed several years ago talking about Zionism's terrorist heritage and noting that the state of Israel was founded and created through acts of terrorism that were perpetrated by Israeli terrorist groups that were for the express purpose of driving the British out of the Palestinian Mandate, and so that the Israeli state could be established. And those people, including the head of the Lehi group and other such people, are now venerated as founding fathers of the Israeli state. So, for example, before 9/11, 2001, before the Twin Towers incident, the most shocking, the most deadly terrorist attack in the world was the bombing of the King David Hotel, which took place in Jerusalem back in 1946, and was seen, this is disputed by historians, but it was seen as an essential part of ultimately driving the British out of the Palestine Mandate and the formation of the Israeli state. And for people who don't know, this was 350 kilograms of explosives that were used to completely level 6 floors of one wing of this busy and occupied hotel, ultimately killing 91 people, including hotel employees and British government staffers and others, 41 Arabs, 28 British citizens, 17 Jews, 2 Armenians, 1 Russian, 1 Greek, and 1 Egyptian. It was a massive, massive event that truly shocked the world when it happened. Now, for years, the Israelis have claimed that, oh, there was warning given in advance. They warned, and the British didn't act on that warning. They didn't clear the hotel, and that's why all those people died. The British dispute this and say there was absolutely no warning. So, well, which side are you going to believe? Well, anyway, what we can say for certain is that on the 60th anniversary of that attack in 2006, there was a grand celebration, a commemoration of that event in which a commemoration plaque was displayed by none other than Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been around in Israeli politics for decades now and has been a driving force behind the Israeli government for a long time. And at the time, the British ambassador to Israel, Simon MacDonald, noted, we don't think it's right for an act of terrorism to be commemorated. There is no credible evidence that any warning reached the British authorities. And it is, I mean, it's truly quite staggering that an act of terrorism like that, in which 91 innocent people were killed, it was again, a massively shocking incident, is now celebrated, and the people behind it are celebrated as founding fathers of the Israeli state. That at least starts to put this picture into perspective, that violence and terrorism are often seen as valid and wonderful after the fact, when they have been effective political tools by the people for whom that the benefits accrued. But vice versa, if, for example, we were to hold Palestinians to the same moral code as we hold Israelis, well, would we be justifying acts of terrorism on that side? My position has always been that killing innocent people is morally wrong. Full stop. Yeah. No debate. There's no more to say about that. It is wrong.
No matter who is doing it or for what reason.
Well, people who find ways of trying to justify the murder of innocents is unfortunately all too common, and they are often supported by mainstream media sources and government officials for whom those types of justifications are necessary for them to be able to continue doing what they are doing. And here's an example that was particularly reprehensible. It's just one of many stories, but it humanizes this in a certain way. Back several years ago, in 2015, there was an arson attack in the West Bank in which Israeli settlers lit a Palestinian family's home on fire, killing the mother, the father, and an 18-month-old baby. The only survivor was a 4-year-old who received second-degree burns to 60% of his body. And in the wake of that, ultimately, Benjamin Netanyahu came out, and to his credit, he did say that this is absolutely despicable, and terrorism, we must be against terror wherever and whenever and however it takes place, and condemned the attack. But what ultimately happened from that, one of the settlers who was charged with that arson, during his trial, you had these extremists who came out to the trial who were, as the little baby who was incinerated in that fire was his grandfather was entering the trial. You had these extremists, dubbed by Haaretz as extremists, chanting, basically taunting him. Where is Ali? Where's your grandson? There is no Ali. Ali burned. Ali is on the grill. And they were chanting, dancing, singing this type of apps. I mean, there's no words to describe how inhumanly disgusting such sentiments are. And I have no doubt that there are similarly disgusting sentiments that are held by some Palestinians on the other side of this conflict. But the question is, who gets a pass for that? When that is reported, most people who are defenders of the Israeli government will say, well, that's just a few extremists. That's not what most people think. But when there's an image of a Palestinian celebrating the death of an Israeli, well, that's all Palestinians. And again, I think that the double standards here seem to be defining the debate for many people.
Hey, my friend, are you an experienced video editor who can also shoot with a camera? If so, then we've got a job for you right here at LifeSite News. We are looking for a full-time video editor / cinematographer to work with me in studio right here in Barry's Bay, Ontario, Canada, to help produce our flagship programs. We will also head out on the road to capture live events such as the March for Life. And if you remember that truckers demo, that was awesome. So other national events will be included. Do you want to try your hand at one of the most exciting places to work in the pro-freedom movement? Join the LifeSite News team to serve Christ and spread his truth on life, faith, family, and freedom. To apply, simply email your resume, demo reel, and cover letter to resumes@lifesitenews.com. Wages are competitive, and relocation package is included. May God bless you, and I hope to see you on the LifeSite News team.
Well, and there are many other incidents of that kind of terrorism that you just described from what I've learned just since October the 7th that are from the past. But 9/11, you mentioned 9/11. Give us a little bit overview of what you discovered on 9/11.
So what I have to say about 9/11 would fill several documentaries, which is why I have created several documentaries on the subject that I would direct people to if they are interested. For example, I've talked about 9/11 trillions, the concept of the follow the money which is, of course, the injunction that we would use in any criminal investigation of anything that takes place. But for some reason, the 9/11 Commission came out in their report to say that the question of where the financing for this came, that's ultimately of little practical significance. Well, I beg to differ. So I did a documentary talking about the various ways in which finances and money was connected to those attacks and various ways you can unwind that money trail. I've talked about 9/11 war games, looking at the multiple dozens, literally, of exercises that that were either taking place on the day of 9/11 or that in some way affected the response to 9/11, including all sorts of simulated hijackings that were taking place on that day, around that time, drills of planes flying into buildings on that day, an entire war game that NORAD was playing that actually inserted false blips onto the radar, which gave rise to these false readings of all these false hijacks. At some point, something like 22 planes were reported as hijacked at some point or other during the chaos of that day. Again, there's an entire story behind all of that and what that seems to imply.
Where did you get all that information from?
It's all completely available out there in the open source information, and I link to every single document. You can go read them yourself. Ask yourself why you have probably never heard that type of information. I can't answer that for you other than to say I think it would not be in the interests of people who are in the establishment to report on such things. I've talked about 9/11 suspects, as in people who should be, if there was ever an actual criminal trial brought to bear on this, people who should probably be brought in to, at the very least, be deposed so that we can find out what they knew and when they knew it. And I've talked about 9/11 whistleblowers, because there's the old refrain, oh, if there was some sort of conspiracy, someone would have blown the whistle. Well, actually, many people have blown the whistle on events that were taking place around 9/11. It's just that, again, you probably haven't heard of them. So there's a lot of information there that's worth delving into.
Well, and I presume it's there are efforts to exclude it from all of the media so that people don't read these things, but you can still get them if you want to.
Yes, you can. And in fact, the real question, again, that comes out of this is, well, who is Al-Qaeda and where did they come from and what was this organization and why don't we hear so much about them anymore? And on that note, I did a 5.5-hour documentary called False Flags, The Secret History of Al-Qaeda, that talks about that organization and where it came from and how it was funded and financed and trained and all of that. So again, there's so much information that the mind boggles at even where to begin talking about it.
Well, give us a short Cole's Notes version of what 9/11 and Al-Qaeda there. Just the brief overview of the most significant conclusions that you found.
Well, there is, at a certain point, even if you were to swallow hook, line, and sinker the official story of what happened that day and the 19 men with box cutters and all of that, at a certain point, even then, the official story leads back to the intelligence agencies that weren't just responsible for bungling or messing up, which of course was a key part of the 9/11 Commission report's findings, which necessitates, of course, more money and more power to go to the intelligence agencies. So in fact, that's actually, in a perverse way, actually part of what they, I think, want out of this, is to be declared incompetent. We just need more money. But it's not just that. There are multiple points at which you can point and put your finger on deliberate acts that had no other effect other than to further along whatever plot was taking place and in whatever way. One of which that I will cite that just came up in the news recently. You might have heard about this amazing new video that's just surfaced from a court trial in which there is a class action lawsuit against the Saudi government by 9/11 victims' family members, saying that the Saudi government had some role in what was taking place on 9/11. As part of that, they have just released a new video of Omar al-Bayoumi, who was a Saudi citizen living in America at that time, who knew two of the alleged hijackers, al-Hazmi and al-Maidar. And the story around this is just so crazy that, again, even just trying to believe the official story hook, line, and sinker is just utterly galling. But apparently, these two dastardly Al-Qaeda terrorists who just came from an Al-Qaeda meeting in Kuala Lumpur that, oh, by the way, was being monitored by the CIA, they just came from that directly into the United States, stepped off the airplane, and randomly ran into this Omar al-Bayoumi at a restaurant in Los Angeles, who, by the way, Omar al-Bayoumi connected into the Saudi government and the Saudi ambassador at the time, receiving payments and all of this. But they just randomly ran into each other, and suddenly Omar al-Bayoumi is saying, okay, come with me. I'll find you a place. I'll get you an apartment here in San Francisco. I'll set you up. I'll pay the first month's rent for you. And who happened to be living in that exact apartment where he set them up? An FBI informant, etc. It goes on and on. But one key part of the story is that, as I say, these two dastardly terrorists just came from a terrorist meeting in Kuala Lumpur directly to the United States that was being monitored by the CIA. The CIA did find, oh, they've got visas to enter the United States. This seems like significant information, but then they lost them after they left Malaysia. It's just, where did they go? I don't know. I can't find them. And as we now know, they deliberately, not by accident, not by incompetence, they deliberately blocked that information about those US visas from going to the FBI for 18 months, which, as multiple FBI insiders have said, if we had that information, we could have rounded them up, and the whole network of these hijackers, we could have rounded them up in a week if we had had that information. But we didn't get it until after the planes started flying into the towers. And there's so many different parts of that. Now, I must stress that I think that there was a lot more going on than simply those alleged hijackers. But having said that, again, even taking the official story at face value, we know 100% there was intelligence agency involvement in what was taking place that day. And again, don't take my word for this. In that documentary, I have Richard Clarke, who was Clinton and then Bush's counterterrorism czar, talking about how he can come to no other conclusion than the director of the CIA, George Tenet, deliberately withheld that information from him that should have gone to him. He should have known about that. The only way that he doesn't know about it is that the director of the CIA deliberately stopped that information from going to him. And this is the counter-terror czar saying this in an interview that was conducted by a couple of independent researchers about 15 years ago. I guarantee you've never seen that interview because it's there on YouTube, but nobody's ever talked about it. There's never been a mainstream report on it. It seems like this might be an important part of the story that maybe we should talk about.
Well, it sounds like they wanted 9/11 to happen. For a reason.
Exactly. And this is why I think the October 7th parallel is so interesting, because once again, we have known for years, the various members of the Likudnik government there in the Israeli Knesset has talked and openly salivated about the prospect of being able, essentially carte blanche, to finish off the job in Gaza and to completely decimate the West Bank and take it over with their settlers. And various members of the government have talked about this openly in the past several years and threatened that there will be very soon there will be moves against the West Bank. And suddenly we have this October 7th shocking catalyzing event that at least for some time rallies everyone around the Israeli flag and becomes carte blanche for the increasing subjugation of the Palestinian people in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that is, I think, again, that's no coincidence. Again, even if we take October 7th completely at face value, it's exactly what they said it was. Still, the question is, how is that used to then justify political agendas that were already waiting in the wings for just such an event? And then who would really have the real political motivation for such an event to take place? Would it be in the best interest of someone like Netanyahu for something like this to take place? And I think there is a credible case to be made for that.
Well, the question to frequently ask is who benefits the most from these kind of incidents happening? And the October 7th, what was extraordinary is how extreme the reaction was to October 7th. Now, October 7th was very bad, of course, and we all condemn that. That was, it was terrorism. A lot of people were killed, approximately 1,200 in total. But on the Gaza side, it is far, far, far beyond that now who have died, and they're still dying. I think it's approaching 100,000 now deaths and severe injuries, which is I don't know why, but a lot of people don't seem to see the comparison of the
Just to
two.
put the number on the table, apparently the British medical journal The Lancet has just come out with its most recent estimate that as many as 186,000 Gazans may be dead now.
Oh my goodness. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's horrifying. And most of them are women and children.
Unfortunately, yes. In fact,
Yeah.
an oft-cited number is that half of the population of Gaza are under 18 years old. So
Yeah.
we're talking about a significant proportion of these people who are dying and being affected, not only directly, obviously, by direct killing, but then by subsequent events, the bombing of the hospitals, the blocking of food, etc. Obviously, people, women and children, are adversely affected by that as well.
Yeah, I've seen videos, so many videos of the hospitals and the people going in very badly injured, having nowhere to go to get health care. And the doctors desperate, absolutely desperate to try and help them. And the doctors breaking down and you know, sobbing because there's nothing they can do for the people beyond what the little they have been able to do. And is this justice? I don't think so, you know.
Well, again, of course, the narrative will insert that this is all justified because, of course, Hamas has built all of these secret structures underneath various hospitals and other things. So they have to, what choice do they have? They have to go in and start bombing hospitals and other such things because the terrorists are hiding behind these human shields. It's Hamas's fault that these women and children are being killed. Well, there are, of course, again, problems with that narrative that came out. For example, if people are interested, they might want to check out my fake news awards from earlier this year. Every year I give out a fake news awards to various news outlets and others that have perpetrated the worst misinformation of the previous year. And my fake news award winner of the year for 2023 was Netanyahu and the Israeli government for their assertions about the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza being a terrorist mastermind base, essentially, where you saw these tunnels underneath the hospital. We had to go in there. And as it turned out, that story, again, had multiple holes in it, including the fact that even BBC Verify, so as mainstream as you can get, even they were asking questions about the Israeli government's official propaganda video that was released about this terrorist mastermind hiding spot that they had. Netanyahu himself retweeted this ridiculous animation that the IDF came up with of the underground bunker layer hidden fortress that Hamas had constructed underneath this hospital. And you have to see this animation to see how utterly stupid they think the average person is in the general public that would fall for this cartoon level stuff. But when they actually got down there and started filming, they found an MRI machine and 2 guns. Or was it 3? One mysteriously appeared during a cut in the video that BBC Verify talked about. But again, just absolute, complete worlds apart from what we were being told as the ostensible justification for this decimation of a hospital and what they ultimately found. And oh, by the way, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak just casually admitted to Christine Amanpour in an interview that they were doing, Christiane Amanpour, he just happened to admit, oh yeah, well actually those tunnels, that tunnel network that was a big part of this justification, actually they were built by Israel back in the 1980s. Yeah, of course, we built all of these underground facilities because we were trying to make use of the space because it's such an enclosed space. I wonder why it's such an... Anyway, because it's one of the densest populated areas on the planet, the Israeli government was building a lot of these tunnels and underground networks, including the one under Al-Shifa Hospital. So it wasn't Hamas that dug out this terrorist mastermind layer, it was Israel. Again, you can deconstruct this propaganda from 18,000 different perspectives, but the propaganda is generally 3 steps ahead and moving on to the next thing. And
That's right.
People have already forgotten about the last thing that they were lied to about.
Now, you've partly answered this, but you, as we do, you get a lot of criticisms and accusations about what you reported on these things. How do you respond to these in general, other than the information is available to anyone? Just take a look. But What else do you do, if anything?
Well, I mean, I report and I let chips fall where they may as to how that reporting affects other people. And once again, I always do stress, do not take my word for things. Please go and examine sources and see if I've got it right. See if you like the sources, etc. Unfortunately, that can become a game in which people know the answer before they look up the answer, and then if they don't find the answer they're looking for, oh, that's because that source isn't reputable. So it can be a game that people play, but that's not my responsibility. I'm putting out there what I think are documentable facts that people can verify and look up for themselves, and what they do with that information is up to them. Now, of course, as you have pointed out, this any criticism specifically of the Israeli government and IDF and what they are doing in Gaza and the West Bank, criticism has been labeled as anti-Semitism, and thus, if you have any question or any problem with what is happening there, if you have any qualms whatsoever about the death of 186,000 Palestinians as a result of whatever took place on October 7th, then you are an anti-Semite, which I believe we are reaching a turning point at which people are starting to see through that and recognize that that is a term that has been weaponized by political forces for political purposes. So that now any criticism, literally, of the Israeli government is swept aside with the use of that term anti-Semitism. And I think enough people are starting to see through that they realize that this is a political game that is being played rather than... Again, who can see into my heart or your heart or any other person's heart? But I know 100%, I know I'm not anti-Semitic. And in fact, I hear also from other people on the other side of this, the other extremist wackadoodles who literally do blame the Jews and Israel for everything. The genuine anti-Semites who genuinely harbor hatred for Jews in their heart. I hear from them criticizing me because you're not against the Jews enough. Well, no, I'm not. I am for humanity, basic human morality. And I think that applies across the board to everyone at all times. And I do not make exceptions. And I don't think it is the Jews that run the world. So I get criticized from that angle. But I do think that the Israeli government does commit atrocities in their treatment of the Palestinian people. So I get criticism from the other side as well. And I don't know if this is a false sense on my part, but at any rate, I do actually feel good that I receive flack from both sides of extremists that I wouldn't want to be associated with.
Yeah, I understand that well. Well, it seems you said that there's a growing realization now of the exploitation of anti-Semitism, and since October the 7th, there's been a large growing focus on Israel. But I think from what I gather, from what we've learned this time, there's a very different international public response to Israel's reaction to a Palestinian attack. And in this case, it was October 7th. It seems only the United States, Britain, and Israel are isolated against the opinions of most of the rest of the world, which is more open-minded about various possible different reactions about what is really happening in Israel. What's your view on that?
I agree. I also think it's important at this point to start differentiating. When you say the United States and Britain, we're talking about the United States government and the British government and not politicians. I think there's a large section of the population of America, of Britain, of other countries that are starting to genuinely question the relationship and why are we supporting this and why are we sending money and funds and arms and aid to this country to help them commit this genocide. I think there's genuinely, for the first time that I can remember in my life anyway, a real genuine groundswell of public opinion against Israel and what it's doing in the Western democracies that have been propping up Israel for all this time. And that is something that I started to notice around the 2014 Operation Protective Edge, in which, if you'll recall, that was the Israeli military incursion into Gaza back in July of 2014. And at that time, I did notice, I think for the first time in my lifetime up to that point, even mainstream outlets, CNN and others, were reporting on some of the atrocities that Israel was committing. For example, wantonly slaughtering Palestinian children on the beach and other such things, were genuine news stories at that time, and were being questioned. And you started to get various groups, NGOs and others, looking into those atrocities and condemning the Israeli government for them, which, as I say, I don't think was unique to that conflict, but I think it was the first time I'd seen reporting on that. Now, there may be a number of factors going into this, one of which I think may be the advent and the rise of social media, in which, for the first time, we are able to actually see some of these images of slaughter, of destruction, without the filter that the mainstream sources would put on it. Because, of course, go back to the 1990s or before, if there was any sort of operation going on in Gaza, the only information you would get about it is through interviews conducted generally with Israeli military officials or politicians. In fact, that is exactly how Netanyahu became a big figure in Israeli politics. Was not in Israel. It was, in fact, on CNN back during the Gulf War, where he became really one of the most articulate spokesmen for the Israeli government. He just happened to be a very good English speaker and spoke very dramatically about the events that were taking place there in the Gulf War. And so he became a big figure in American media circles. And as a result, that actually catapulted him up the ladder in terms of Israeli politics. So there is an element of, this is clearly about media relations, because of course that is an incredibly important part of getting public support behind this agenda. And that system is coming, at least starting to destabilize. And I think the rise and the advent of social media and of the internet itself is part of that, the breakdown of the monopolization of information that we've seen over the past, the preceding century. So that, I think, is to the good. At any rate, the conversation is expanding and more people are at least aware of these criticisms. Before, I think it was easier to dismiss them. Oh, that's just some crazy fringe anti-Semites who have some qualms about what's going on in Israel. No, I think there's now the realization, oh, there's many people who think about this, and that becomes a bit of the snowball rolling down the hill. It gains momentum as more people realize, oh, this isn't unusual. I can actually have my qualms about what the Israeli government is doing to Palestinians, and that doesn't make me an anti-Semite. And I think the more people that realize that, you start to see more pushback against what's going on right now.
Well, and it could be seen as trying to be helpful towards Israel as well. It's not condemning Israel totally.
See, this is the important point, and this is why we have to make that distinction, for example, between the U.S., as in the U.S. government or the U.S. population. It's the exact same way, the Israeli government or the Israeli people. And what when we talk about loving Israel or hating Israel or whatever it is, what specifically are we talking about? Because yes, of course, the actual anti-Semites would hate Israel simply because it is Jewish and they hate Jews. But I think people who are at least actually critiquing Zionism, the political ideology of Zionism, as in the Israeli government can do whatever it feels like in order to take care of the Palestinian problem, which is seen as nothing other than a problem. When we critique that specifically, then yes, I would say that that is actually to the good of the Israeli people and Israel generally, but not the Israeli government, and certainly not Netanyahu and the Likudniks and the other people who happen to be in positions of political power right now. And that's an important distinction to make, because once again, unfortunately, one of the most effective pieces of mind control that has ever been waged on the human population is the rallying of people's identity, essentially, and wrapping it up in a flag so that anything that you can associate with that flag must be good. And anyone who critiques or condemns that must be, oh, you're against me, you're against us, you're against our family, you're against our nation. Unfortunately, that's been very, very effective in stirring up madness in various forms throughout many, many centuries. And this is the latest iteration of that. And to the extent that we can separate critique of the Israeli government, the Israeli military, the IDF, these forces, from actually loving and caring about people in Israel, Palestinians and Israelis. If we can do that, I think then we've accomplished something truly valuable moving forward. If we can change the narrative about this so that it isn't simply blindly supporting whatever the people in positions of political authority are doing, then I think that's to the good. And one example of that is exactly what you pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, is that the people who were treated as pincushions for this experimental medical intervention technology over the past few years, first and foremost, the Israeli citizens themselves. They were not beneficiaries of this. They were the victims of what Netanyahu and Burla and that gang of cronies were doing to the Israeli people, using them as the human pincushions in their global experiment that I think ultimately is moving towards at least the fostering of a potential human population culling that could take place in the future based on these types of technologies. And so I think it's protecting the Israeli people, to protect them from their own government and the maniacal psychopaths who tend to infest positions of political power.
Well, truth can only be good for Israel. And there are a lot of commentators who we follow right now, and they're very critical of Israel, of the Israeli government and the IDF, but part of their reason is they're afraid for Israel that it may be committing cultural, political, national suicide right at this time by going as far as it has been against the Palestinians, and uniting and arising a very strong reaction from the surrounding Islamic states, which don't want they don't want to get involved in a war, but Israel is provoking them into war. So the truth may help save Israel from what could be this time a disastrous result, especially if they start to go attacking Hezbollah and Iran, and then with Russia coming in and maybe even China coming in.
It's an old adage that war is the health of the state. And
Yeah.
I think people really need to understand and internalize that message, because yes, most people, most of the time, are not interested in war. The last thing on the mind of the average person is, oh, can I go off to that place to go kill a bunch of people? Most normal human beings do not think that way and do not benefit from that in any way. The people who benefit are the people in positions of political power. And that is why, for example, disastrous, horrible things like October 7th, which was truly a horrible thing. Again, I think that the taking of innocent life is a bad thing, no matter when and where and how it happens. But the people who benefit from that may actually desire such events to take place. And here's an interesting case in point. In the wake of 9/11, Benjamin Netanyahu was quoted as saying, he was quoted as saying Israel benefited from 9/11. What? Why? Oh, it's because, now America understands the war of terror, so they'll go after Israel's enemies. And we saw what that ultimately equated to with Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and other misadventures probably soon to take place. So yes, the average person does not benefit from and does not want war. War is essentially, generally speaking, a gigantic deception and manipulation of public opinion to get people into that bloodthirsty state where their critical faculties turn off. And to the extent that we can stop that from happening, again, as you say, Israel would benefit from truth. Humanity would benefit from truth.
Yes,
every single person, every institution would be better if we could just start with a baseline of truth and openness and transparency and honesty. If we had that, well, we'd be in a lot better position than we are now.
Yeah. Israel is considered or alleged to be the United States' greatest international ally. And yet there are, well, first of all, there's the billions of dollars of aid that goes to Israel all the time for all of its various needs, but mostly military. Then we have such things as the dancing Israelis on 9/11, the Israeli spying on the U.S., James Pollard and the Israeli nuclear weapons program, the USS Liberty incident. What kind of perspective do these provide? These have been going on for years from Israel. What's your reaction to those?
Yes, again, this is part
of Israel as an ally,
Yeah, exactly right. Well, this is part of that grander context to something like October 7th. Where do you start the clock and what do you look at?
Yeah.
And yes, there's many, many, many incidents that we could talk about. So I went back to the King David Hotel bombing and other incidents of Irgun terrorism that helped establish the state of Israel. But there's been many, many such incidents since then. For example, people may or may not know about the USS Liberty and the way that it was strafed and attacked for hour after hour after hour by the Israelis. Israeli military in an attempt to send it to the bottom, as it were, back in 1967, and thankfully failed, but unfortunately did kill a lot of American sailors who to this day still try to get the word out about what really happened that day and the fact this was not some oops, we accidentally attacked an American vessel. There's a whole story about that. You bring up, for example, the dancing Israelis. I did, as part of my 9/11 suspect series, I did an entire video about the so-called dancing Israelis, which for people who don't know was this group of Israeli contractors who on the morning of 9/11, within minutes of the first strike of the first plane into the Twin Towers. So before the second strike, before 99% of the population had any idea what was going on, these men were not just seen, but actually photographed at a vantage point, the Doric Towers in New Jersey, from that parking lot where they had a clear view of what was happening and what was unfolding there, where they were actively seen celebrating, holding up a lighter, rejoicing, to the point where someone who saw this taking place ultimately ended up reporting it, and they got stopped by, there was an APB that was issued. They were stopped later in the day, taken in for questioning, held for months, ultimately shipped back to Israel. There were IDF members that were involved in this group. The photographs, the censored photographs have eventually come out. They blur out various parts of it. It's 17th generation copy of a copy of a copy, etc. But you can see the photographs that they were taking that day, celebrating the attacks as they were taking place. There's an entire story surrounding that, but that actually feeds into an even larger story about Israeli art spy rings that were infiltrating various parts of various U.S. Municipal, state, and federal government at that time. Israeli art students that were going around and using that as a cover, essentially, to gain access to various places. There was a multiple-part Fox News report that aired briefly towards the end of 2001 by Carl Cameron that was talking about Israeli spying in the United States and the fact that Israel was in fact the largest committer of espionage against the United States in the world. That report was quashed very quickly and never seen again, but parts of it have been preserved online, so you can go look that up. And that feeds into a much bigger story about Israeli spying generally and Israeli cyber espionage, which has really taken to the fore in recent years, led by this Unit 8200, which is part of the signals intelligence arm of the Israeli intelligence community. And this secretive organization, something like the NSA, is dedicated towards cyber spying, hacking, that sort of operation. And it turns out that Stuxnet, the virus that was dreamt up, and ultimately it was begun by the NSA. They began working on that to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. But it was Unit 8200 that juiced that particular virus up to the state where it became militarily operational. And Unit 8200 has been responsible for producing all of these ex-Unit 8200 members who go on to found various companies, related to Israeli tech operations that have cyber espionage uses. For example, Carbine 911, which is this weird firm that is purporting to create this technology that will help 911 operators in the United States primarily, but around the world presumably, emergency operators deal with phone calls and other such things. It's that kind of handling software that, by the way, was funded by people like Jeffrey Epstein and was founded by some ex-Unit 8200 members that gives emergency operations capabilities and backdoor access to various Israeli intelligence operatives. There's Pegasus, which made news a few years ago, which the headlines were all about these horrible rogue states, Turkey or Saudi Arabia or whoever, were buying this software that would allow them to wiretap and eavesdrop on conversations, even with people with their phone turned off, et cetera, et cetera. It was this super spying technology that was developed by, oh, that's right, again, ex-Unit 8200 members that, oh, by the way, it was later found that not only were the whatever government that was using the software would have access to those wiretaps, but oh yeah, it would also be interceptable by third parties who had access to that, like maybe the Israeli intelligence community. So there's Amdocs, Converse, Infosys. There's, again, many different aspects of this. But one of them that I went over, for example, in my recent podcast episode about Meet Benjamin Netanyahu, Unconvicted War Criminal, I talked about, oh, did you know he was involved in an Israeli nuclear smuggling ring that was operating in the United States to smuggle nuclear technology, specifically these types of triggers, dual-use triggers that were used as part of the Israeli nuclear weapons development program, which doesn't exist officially. Benjamin Netanyahu was named in those documents as one of the people involved in the smuggling ring. Again, FBI documents. You can go read them for yourself. There's so much information regarding this.
And James Pollard, who was the main spy on all of that, he's celebrated as a great hero now after getting out of 30 years of prison in the United States, and he's back in Israel, and you know, for his spying on the nuclear weapons program.
Again, there's just so much information that it becomes overwhelming, and
yeah,
then to contrast that with the types of statements that American politicians uniformly and across the board, no matter what side of the political aisle they're on, pledging their fealty to Israel in front of AIPAC, generally speaking, when they give one of their main speeches on their campaign trail, but generally saying things that would be shocking in any other context, to the point where various politicians have talked about how they support Israel first and foremost. It's absolutely insane to think about in any other context, except for some reason support for Israel is given that kind of pass. And once again, I think it's just the double standard is obvious. The only thing that could justify that in someone's head is a certain political narrative. And I think if people even just begin questioning that narrative, I think we will have made some progress towards solving the problem.
Well, that's the key item, is to be able to just simply ask questions and then find answers. And for some reason with Israel, it seems you're not allowed to do that. As opposed to any other nation, it has some kind of special privilege given to it, supposedly. You know, which does create and lead to many more serious problems. Do you see any connection between the two wars that are going on, Ukraine and Israel? Is there anything that you see that there's a connection between the two of those?
I suppose there are a number of connections that could be drawn. One that springs to mind is, again, the narrative that surrounds these types of conflicts, which is to say that in the Ukraine conflict, we were told from day one, to the point where it became almost suspicious how completely embedded in the narrative surrounding that conflict this idea was, that this was completely unprovoked. That word, unprovoked, was used as almost a mantra to talk about this conflict, which just seems odd. Again, it's asking us to believe that the clock started in February 2022. That's when history began, and nothing that took place before that could possibly have any relevance, like, say, in the winter of 2021, moving into 2022, when Ukraine was openly talking about, well, maybe we would want to have nuclear weapons capabilities in order to counteract Russian threats, and maybe we do want to join NATO, etc., etc. Again, I certainly don't think that this justifies military incursions and what have you, but the fact that the narrative was so much about unprovoked, there was just no reason for this. It's out of the blue. It's complete madness on the part of Russia, again, shows that I think there is a narrative that is being constructed that's meant to manipulate people into supporting conflict. And I find it truly fascinating to watch for example, in America now, with the left in political power, you see people on the left who, in any other period of history, at least in my entire lifetime, you would see people on the left were generally against the big corporate megastructures and the big corporate oligopoly and against the military industrial complex. But 2024, we have those very same people defending the intelligence agencies, the military industrial complex. Literally, I've seen people citing DOD documents and press releases about why it's so important for the US to be sending billions of dollars of aid to Ukraine. Well, see, it's for our national interest. And these are, I guarantee you, the exact same people that 20 or 30 years ago, or even 10 or 15 years ago, probably would have been talking a very, very different thing about DOD press releases about the war in Iraq, for example. So it's fascinating to watch. And again, I think that speaks once again to the fact that narrative is so important in setting what people believe. People subscribe to a narrative and then try to make facts and reality conform to that narrative. And that's fascinating to watch. It's also scary to watch because it really does raise the question of how do you have a genuine conversation with someone who has been so warped by a narrative?
Well, I know you have to go. There is an enormous amount of very interesting and I'd say useful information on your website. How do people view the many reports that you've published and learn what is not available in most of the news media today?
They can go to corbettreport.com, CORBETT report.com, and they can find, well, all of the information that we've been talking about today. For example, I had that Meet Benjamin Netanyahu podcast recently documenting his political career. I had a conversation about Israel's 9/11 shortly after October 7th took place. I've got a report on 9/11 suspects to the dancing Israelis. I've got a report on the cyber espionage, Israel cyber spying, and that sort of information we're talking about. But whatever people are interested in, there's, as I say, thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of reports there on my website, completely available for free. You don't have to sign up for anything. You don't have to pay me a cent. So I hope people will use it as a resource.
But you can accept donations. And on your website, there is a place to give donations. Is that correct?
That's right. You can sign up to become a member of the Corbett Report, which gives you access to a subscriber newsletter that I do. The editorial for that newsletter I also post completely for free. But if people want to sign up for that, they can do so. But again, no obligation.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. We could have gone on for 5 hours, to be honest with you, but time is limited. So thank you again. And I encourage all of our readers to take a look at the Corbett Report website and find out the truth yourself. Goodbye, everybody. And thank you, James.
Thank you.
Do you know the world is closer than ever to World War III? Global war is coming, and soon. And it's absolutely necessary that the global public receives accurate, unbiased, nonpartisan coverage of world affairs. A well-informed public holding politicians to account is one of the strongest guarantees of international cooperation. Only independent media, like LifeSite News, are consistently providing this coverage. In a world where mainstream media is controlled by big government and big business, LifeSite News is actually a crucial component in international dialogue and world peace. That's why our enemies will do anything possible to take us offline or suppress our message. That's why we need your urgent support so that we can educate the global public and play our part in maintaining world peace. Go to give.lifesitenews.com today